Welcome, everyone. We're so excited to have each and every one of you here with us today to be in conversation with Warren Binford and Michael Bocheneck as they talk about their wonderful new publication, Hear My Voice. I'm not sure about each of you, but I know that I was excited when this book came onto the scene. As a bookseller, as an attorney, and as an educator, I can't imagine a more relevant book for our times. In fact, this picture book is already being called, with its heart-wrenching and hopeful words and innovative artwork, one of the most important picture books of the year, and I believe that it is. So today, in collaboration with Indies Unite, which is a group of independent bookstores working together to put together a hard-hitting series of virtual groups challenging the status quo, and bookshop.org, we are presenting Hear My Voice by Warren Binford and Michael Bocheneck. Warren Binford is the, Warren Binford is the endowed chair of pediatric law, ethics, and policy at the University of Colorado. She is an international children's rights expert, published nearly 60 law review articles, book chapters, essays, and other publications. She has her JD from Harvard Law School, and she holds an Ed.M from Boston University. Michael is senior counsel at the Children's Rights Division of the Human Rights Watch, focusing on juvenile justice and refugee and immigrant children. He's researched and reported on criminal and juvenile justice and prisons conditions, the protection of refugees and internationally displaced persons, and the exploitation of migrant workers and other labor issues. He also holds a bachelor from Michigan State University and a law degree from Columbia. In addition, he speaks Spanish, Portuguese, and English, which is a big important part of this book as it is published, and I'll hold it up for everybody, in both English, and it's a great flip book also published in Spanish. One of my favorite parts of this book. I remember the first time I picked it up, I'm like, why is this so heavy? It's so heavy in so many important ways. So for now, I'm going to turn it over to Warren and Michael as they first speak with each other about their work, and then in a few minutes, we'll get some of your questions as well. Go ahead.
Thank you so much, Christina. And thank you for all of you for joining us today. And Michael, oh my gosh, I've missed you so much during the pandemic. I know that we were heading down the border pretty frequently and furiously until it all came to a halt early last year. And I first want to just say, how are you doing, Michael? Where are you? What kind of work are you doing?
I'm doing really well. I'm in New York right now, and I've been in New York for a couple of weeks. The pandemic really did stop the work, the in-person work on the border, but it didn't stop the work entirely. So at least from my side, it turned out that I was able to do a lot of WhatsApp calls, a lot of video calls with people who were on either side of the border. And in some ways, I think they even welcomed the opportunity, even if it was only on a screen or over a speaker, to be able to talk to somebody about what they were experiencing. But yeah, it's been a long couple of years.
Yes, it certainly has. Do you remember when we first met in 2017?
I was just thinking about that. My memory of it was at a conference table in a immigration detention center in South Texas, just before we walked into a series of interviews with women, and mostly women, and their children, about what their experiences were in immigration detention. It's quite a trip.
And do you remember the report that you were working on at the time?
You're gonna have to remind me. Was I working on the freezers report then?
You were.
This is.
Do you want to?
Yeah. So the first point of contact that people have with the United States, with United States officials, with any immigration agent, is apprehension at the border and detention. So they're locked up in very, very small holding cells that were designed to be really temporary facilities, designed for like a few hours, designed with an adult population in mind, built at a time when most people who were locked up were men looking for work and were there for really only really less than a couple of hours. And as a result, they're not really suitable in any way for longer term detention, and they're definitely not suitable for children. Nonetheless, families, and in some cases, single kids who were, unaccompanied kids, were locked up in these very, very tiny cells, sometimes in really overcrowded conditions. Um, Essentially a bit of a black hole because nobody knows what goes on inside there unless you can find some way, as you and I did, of getting in and talking to them. And the reason that I called the report the freezers report is because everybody referred to these cells as the freezers because they were so cold that they felt like freezers. And I have to say, they really were cold. I was able, because I'm, a lawyer, whenever I went into those, to take in, I basically took in the same kind of things we would take on a hike when the weather's going to change. So I had a wool layer, I had another layer. I thought I was prepared, but I still would have to get up after doing, talking to people for a couple of hours straight. I'd have to get up every half hour and walk around because my fingers were cold and my toes were cold. And, and I was able to wear extra clothing, which most people were not.
Yeah. And then do you remember we did some other visits, a number of visits, and one of the next big visits wasn't the very next visit, but it was later on that year, we went to the Walmart together. And do you remember we went to the Walmart and we saw about 1,500 kids who were made to line up in single file lines and basically march in single file lines past that mural of Donald Trump 3 times a day, actually 6 times if you talk about coming and going. And at the bottom of that mural, it said something to the effect of, sometimes in order to win the war, you have to lose the battle. And I couldn't figure out what that meant. And I go back to that again and again. What is this messaging that we have these kids dressed in uniforms marching, past this mural? And we went over to the adult detention center while we were in the area, and we interviewed some of the parents who had been separated from their children. And so we were hearing from the children, some of their accounts of being separated from their families. And then we heard some of the parents who had their children taken away from them. And I remember that the stories of kids who were being taken under false pretense. I remember that one mom who told us that she was told by government authorities that her child was being taken to the showers and that she was then taken away from her child and that she had not seen that child since. And I remember I had the chills because of what happened in the Holocaust and the separation of children from their parents and being told that the children were being taken to the showers. And I was thinking, my God, what is going on here and what are we doing? And then the children that we interviewed, some of the children that we interviewed talked about after darkness fell, being put on buses without their parents and driven for all night long presumably across state lines until they were taken to the bus station in a giant city in Texas and then put on vans and then eventually taken to Casa Padre, that Walmart or other places. And I'm wondering if you had ever seen anything like that previously in history, as you interviewed children and adults around the world, of this separation of children from their parents and, explanations like that, being given. And then basically, the kids almost, virtually being kidnapped by the government, from parents.
It is amazing how inventive, and I mean inventive in a nefarious way, governments can be when they want to, right? It would take very little to be to treat people with basic humanity and dignity, right? Like, fair enough, have some sort of processing system in a reception center that offers the kind of sense of security and safety that people really need after long journeys. But yeah, that's not what we were seeing. I mean, there's a couple of things that you mentioned that I think are maybe worth just going back to. people hear Walmart and I think they think, oh, we went shopping. No, it was a converted Walmart, and it was apparently one of the, do they call it a super Walmart? 4 times the size I kept hearing of the ordinary Walmart, converted into a child protection shelter. So stop for a minute there and think about, like, how do you have children adequately cared for in a facility of any significant size, let alone when there are 1,500 and it's a size of a converted Walmart. No, that's pretty incredible. And then add to that the sort of deception, the lying that was happening, that immigration agents, individual immigration agents, not all of them, some of them were actually quite, I think quite concerned about what was going on. Maybe we can talk more about that in a minute. But just not even owning up to their part in what was really a horrific set of circumstances. And so I would hear parents tell me again and again, oh yeah, the agent said she'll be right back. Or the agent said, you have to go to court, but when you come back, your kid will be here. And none of that was true. I mean, so of course, what happened then is that was how the family separation policy of the Trump administration was carried out. That was when it was carried out. Kids, and in some instances, kids taken away from the arms of their parents. Now, Warren, one story that always gives me the chills is when, I think it was you, if I'm not mistaken, had to stop a parent and child from being removed from each other without having a chance to say goodbye. Do you remember that in one of the what's one of those freezer facilities, one of those small scale border detention centers? What was the context? What happened?
I think that you and I need to sit down and write a historical account of what happened, because I fear that, with each passing day, I remember less and less the details of it. But I do, now that you mention it, I do remember, having to argue and basically force the parent and the child from being separated. It was actually, the one that I'm thinking about was in San Diego. Do you remember that?
I don't think I was there for that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, that's the one that's coming to my mind, and it's absolutely brutal. I mean, it involves a child who had cerebral palsy, whose dad was 4 years old, and the child was about 32 pounds, something like that. And the gangs had targeted the family. The dad was a small business owner. It was like a produce shop. He didn't pay enough. And so they literally walked all the way with 3 children, including this son with cerebral palsy on his chest. And they walked through a sandstorm in the desert, crossing into the U.S. They had family in the U.S. They had a nephew that they had raised since he was 6 months old, whose mother, is the father's sister, lived in the U.S. And they came and they virtually, arrested the dad, took the boy with cerebral palsy away, took a newborn baby away, and then they were going to take the 4-year-old nephew that he and his wife had raised away without saying goodbye. And, when I found out, I got very upset. I was very insistent about the trauma that was going to be caused to this 4-year-old boy if they did not let, him say goodbye to the only father he had really known, who was, technically his uncle, but factually, the father, because he's the one who had, cared for him as a father since he was an infant. And they held each other and they hugged each other for so long. And it was such a meaningful connection to witness. But then in the course of that, we discovered that these other 2 children had been taken away, including, the cerebral palsy son and the infant. And we were able to work with hospital attorneys and other attorneys to force Border Patrol to bring this family together and to exempt them, from these family separation practices that they were implementing on a widespread basis. And, that family is doing well and pursuing their legal claims to remain in the United States. But when you think about the brutality of breaking up a family that includes an infant, a cerebral palsy boy who has been physically, in his father's arms almost his entire life, as well as this other nephew, it really gives you a window into the inhumanity that we were witnessing. And we witnessed that again when we went to the Tornillo tent city, where literally that was set up intentionally in, on land that only the federal government had jurisdiction over, so that they could keep 3,500 children in tents in the desert. And, that's that picture that I'm using as a backdrop today. And then, of course, we famously, first time that we went public, went into the Clint Border Patrol facility in June 2019. And those were the accounts that we used for Hear My Voice, Escucha Mi Voz. What do you remember about Clint?
Well, that was really remarkable because, although by that point I'd been in a lot of Border Patrol facilities, there was nothing, I don't think, quite matched what I was seeing and hearing, more hearing because we weren't technically allowed to go beyond the interview rooms, although I know you managed to do so. But the sheer number of kids, first of all. Second, the conditions that they were coming to us in. We were essentially looking at the roster, the sort of like the roster of kids in the facility that day, pointing to ones that we wanted to see based on whatever criteria we could get. But the point for us was that we were choosing, not the institution was choosing who we spoke to. And then they would come to us, sort of like exhausted, visibly dirty. The faces still had dirt on them, wearing the same clothes they'd arrived in. When we asked how long they'd been there, in some cases it was a week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks. No showers, or really irregular showers. It's hard to tell what was going on there because the facility did have some access to showers. Some kids had been able to get some, but we were never, at least I don't think I ever quite figured out on what basis they offered some kids showers and how frequently. And then the final thing, I guess, is just that they were, well, two final things. One was that they had packed in so many kids that they were successively repurposing different parts of the facility so that there was what appeared from the descriptions of the children to be sort of an ordinary set of cells with way too many kids in them, along with a sort of newer section that was essentially like a very, very large dormitory with what sounded like dozens and dozens of bunk beds in it. And then also a repurposed loading dock. They'd sort of like just put a temporary roof over something and thrown a bunch of kids into what was, it sounded to me like a loading dock. And when we drove around, that's exactly what it looked like. And then, and then the final thing, and I think possibly the most heart-wrenching, was just hearing kid after kid say that they hadn't talked to their parents since they'd arrived, that their parents, as far as they knew, had no idea where they were. And sometimes we were picking up our phones and just trying to reach people. And it was the first time in weeks that the parent had any idea that not just where the child was, but that the child was safe.
Yeah. I remember when we were calling the parents, and we normally didn't call parents. When we interviewed children, we normally didn't call parents, but because of the extreme neglect and arguably abuse that we were witnessing, we started calling the parents. These were highly distressed children, and virtually every single call that I placed, either the parent or family member picked up immediately or listened to our message and called back within 2 minutes. These were all kids. There wasn't a single call that I placed that wasn't answered or responded to immediately. So these were not kids who were lost, who were without family. And I remember parents saying, I will get on the next plane. Where do I go? Where do I go to pick up my daughter? Where do I go to pick up my son? Or I will send you the money I'm here in Los Angeles, I'm here in Dallas, like, tell me where to send the money so that you can send, my child to me. These were not kids who were abandoned. These were not children who were unloved. Every single one of them had usually a parent, but not a parent, then a close family member, like a grandma who was waiting for the child in the United States and seemed to be fully capable and expecting to take care of them. And so there was really no need for these children to be in government care. And in it, I know that you referred to it as a dormitory, but I want to make clear it was a warehouse. That dormitory was a warehouse. And that when the kids were describing it, we couldn't figure out, based upon a layout of the Border Patrol facility, where it was, what it was that they were describing. Because like you say, it sounded like a dormitory. But then when we drove around, we saw that brand new warehouse that had been erected recently. And we realized when we went the next day and had some of the children draw pictures of where they were staying, that the pictures that one of the boys drew, right down to the number of porta potties outside the door and the location of the shower trailer, which had been brought in a few days before, according to a number of children's accounts, that it matched precisely. And then it was like, oh my God, our worst fear is true. They are literally warehousing children. And we decided to contact the children's attorneys and to let them know what was going on. And it's really the first time that you and I had talked to the media about a visit that we had done. And that led to this book. So why do you think it was so important for us to go public about what it was that we were documenting in the court case, Flores, which is what had taken us into a lot of these facilities in the first place?
And so, ordinarily we are going to these facilities for the purpose of informing the court about compliance or lack of compliance with the basic court order about keeping kids in safe and sanitary facilities. And I can't say that what we typically found was very good. And in fact, our reports to the court were pretty scathing. But this was so bad for all the reasons that we've talked about. Kids held, it effectively amounts to what we, in my job, I often see in countries that have far less pretense of a respect for rule of law. The practices like incommunicado detention and enforced disappearance. That's what this felt like, right? Kids are thrown into a facility and nobody is told where they are. And to be put in such conditions, I think for anybody would be really difficult. For children, so much more so. Not even getting to the factors that led them to leave their country, to flee their country, and to try to seek safety in the United States. So not only are these children who have, as we know, a whole variety of needs and a whole lot less preparation in terms of dealing with adversity as compared with adults, but also many of them had suffered torture in their home countries, death threats of really serious kinds. And that was the motive for leaving in many cases. They'd done so, they'd had a really arduous journey through Mexico, traveling on their own or traveling with adults who may or may not have had their best interests at heart. And then they've arrived in the US and they think they've finally reached safety and they think they're going to be with relatives. And to sort of be let down in this way, I think would be devastating for any kid. I think for this particular population, it was really traumatizing. So all of those things were I think why we, it was still a discussion we needed to have with the rest of the legal team, but it was a relatively, once we started laying out what kinds of things we were seeing and just what a radical departure this was from any sort of acceptable, safe and secure, safe and healthy environment. It really then became quite easy to think we needed to do something to let the general public know what was happening.
So, Michael, there are a couple of questions coming in the Q&A. The first one is, what have you two experienced are the most common general challenges in classrooms or having discussions around books like this, and both in mainly white student populations, but also in more diverse class populations?
Yeah, do you want to start first, or shall I go?
Why don't you go first?
Well, I guess what's interesting about this is that, obviously, and as this discussion sort of illustrates, we're throwing up a lot of things that are sort of both individual policies. Family separation is one, automatic detention at the border is another. We haven't talked about some of the other Trump era policies that that came into play later on. So after these visits that we've been talking about, and finally, an immigration law that is pretty hostile and has been pretty hostile since 1996 to asylum seekers. So it's complicated to sort of get all this in a way that makes any sense, because in some ways it's almost designed not to make sense. And that's true with whomever we talk about. I think that the more diverse the audience, the more this sounds like not an unfamiliar account. These aren't unfamiliar events, unfortunately. And so those discussions, I think, in fact, are a little bit easier because there's a sort of common understanding of what's happening. My mother still tells this story about sort of realizing that not every family has the same experience of immigration, of contact with Border Patrol that, say, would be, I think, unfortunately, all too common for Latinos. So she's talking about her own experiences of being stopped at the border, being pulled over between the U.S. and Canada for speaking Spanish to her mother as she's crossing. And I remember one of these from when I was a kid. And she told this story to a friend of hers who is white, who could not believe that this happened. She said, no, we cross all the time. They never pull us over. How can this possibly? So, and she was saying, like, how could it be that she doesn't know that this is happening? This has been going on for decades. And I think sometimes there's just a sort of a difference in perspective that really means that you start at a much earlier stage and sort of like having to set the scene when talking about these kinds of issues.
Yeah.
I don't know what your experiences were in your classroom settings, for example.
Well, there are a couple that come to mind. One is, I was very humbled to receive from a fourth grade classroom an email from their librarian telling us that their fourth grade had selected Hear My Voice as the book of the year, and that's what the children voted, their book of the year. And it was a classroom in the Bay Area that was predominantly Latino, Latinx, and it reinforced exactly what you're saying, that in some populations, this is a truth that is part of their family history, that is part of their community history, even if it's not part of their direct family history. And so to be able to see it in print and to see the powerful pictures that accompany it, and to know that, people sometimes refer to this as our book, and you and I are trying to be very clear, this is not our book. This is a children's book. It is written by children. And every single part of the text content, except for your introduction to my back matter, is taken directly from the children's own testimonies, word for word. and that they are basically arranged thematically, but they are all the children's words, that they come from the testimonies that the children gave us during the interviewing process. And so this is very much their book. They are the authors. And I think that approach, that firsthand testimony, being amplified, being elevated, and giving, bringing to light publicly what many families experience in the United States really resonated with this population of students. And so I think that in that type of setting, it's very affirming to have their history told, and particularly to have their history told by other children who have lived through these harrowing experiences. I think that in mixed classrooms or white dominant classrooms, that we run into the same challenges that you are describing in the border crossings with your own mom when she was speaking Spanish, which is something that I've experienced as well, which is that I have had a lovely, peaceful relationship with police historically. I had a lovely, peaceful, highly facilitating relationship with border and other immigration officers historically. And when I married my husband, who does not appear as I do, that we were stopped almost every single time that we crossed as a couple. Whereas when I was crossing individually with my own presentation, it was no problem. I was always passed through. Everyone was always lovely. And when you start to be exposed to other people's experiences, you start to understand that your experience is not definitive, for the universe of, of people. And I think that this book helps to bring into the consciousness for those who experience different types of privilege, whether it's their neighborhood or their skin color or their educational, history, socioeconomic status, whatever it is that privileges them from being native born, this book helps to create that mosaic of other people's experiences, other people's history, that help to inform the decisions that we make as citizens with the power of voting. And that's one of the reasons why I believe so strongly in educating openly and accurately, but with the appropriate levels of adult support and guidance of what is happening in the world for our children. And so, I talk with my own children about immigration practices. I talk about our own children about the consequences of the climate crisis. I talk with our own children, about, racial justice and the need to address racial injustices. And it's only when they have an accurate understanding of the truths and the different perspectives and the different experiences of what's happening in the world will they be able to be responsible citizens, in my mind, and be able to exercise that very serious power of, voting in a democracy that helps to change the course of history. There was another question that came up, and it says, during what part of this process did you realize you had a picture book? In other words, how or when did you decide that a picture book was the best avenue to amplify the children's voices? And Michael, if I could go first on this one. So as you'll recall, we had an overwhelming media storm when we went public about the children at Clint. And we had about 10 days of round the clock coverage. And although we were really grateful for the opportunity to educate the public about what was going on at the border, it seemed as though the children were getting lost, and it was being pulled into debates about immigration, and it was being pulled into partisan politics, and the children themselves were being politicized, and they were relying on us to, speak to the issue, and losing the children's voices and their accounts in the process. And I remember talking to different media, both reporters and news anchors and such, about you need to go to the court records and read the children's testimonies, because at that point the attorneys had filed a TRO, and so a lot of the testimonies were publicly available, but they were behind a paywall. And the reporter said, it's too difficult for us to get to those testimonies. Tell us what they say. And it was at that point that we talked about creating a pop-up nonprofit to post the children's testimonies so that anybody in the world could access them directly, read them for themselves, and that we then would call on artists and musicians and other creative types to read the children's testimonies and find ways to tell the children's stories and help amplify their choices and voices. And that's when the idea for the children's book, there were, of course, some art exhibits that were created. There was, of course, the musical theater community created the events in Chicago. We had the Broadway community create the videos by different actors and high profile individuals in New York. We, of course, had the, call from Neil Simon, was it? No, Neil, who's the songwriter who called up the folk music community and asked for songwriters to write songs, and one of them became the semifinalist for Folk Song of the Year. And it was just overwhelming, the number of people. We, of course, had the first episode from South Park do an entire episode about the Clint Border Patrol station. We had the comics book that was created inspired by the children's testimonies. And so, the children's book was basically the contribution of the children's book illustrators, and then, the creative design team coming forward and saying, here's what we can do to help amplify the children's voices. But the idea was to recognize the role that artists and musicians and people in the humanities play in helping to inform and imbue and interpret history. And I think they did an amazing job, with all of these initiatives, including this book, which, I think is so powerful. And I'm so grateful to it almost was 100 people when you include the children and the illustrators and everybody else, the publisher, who all came together and like ponied up the money for the, making sure that it appeared in both English and Spanish, which I agree is so critically important. So do you have anything to add about, the children's book and the inspiration for it?
Well, I think that it was inspired, right? An inspired choice on your part to try to pitch this in this way, not because you would necessarily want a child to read it without context, but because it is just such an amazing way to remember that these are the words of children. And I think it does get to the other question that's been posted, which is about trauma and the relationship between trauma and art. The writer says, you take darkness and you somehow end in hope. Is that art or is that something else? I wonder what you think about that, Warren.
It's hard to think deeply because I feel somewhat traumatized, having witnessed child abuse and neglect intentionally committed, by our government in our names, purportedly on our behalf, and to witness that and to be able to do so little about it. And I don't know if it's anything more than passing the baton. And maybe this is what is the hope, is knowing that we're not alone in doing this work, that you and I can use our law degrees and our, roles as children's rights experts to be invited to visit these facilities and interview the children and document what we see. But I don't have the ability to organize the art exhibit that happened near the White House with over 100 pieces of conceptual art created. I don't have the power to create a illustrated children's book. I don't have the power to write a song or perform a song, and so I think it's like looking beyond ourselves and what we can do, and seeing that there are other people who also care, who trust us in the accounts that we both collected and that we give about what we witnessed. And it could be like the hope of being in community, of caring about children that most of whom you and I will never meet, most of whom the country will never meet, and asking people to find ways to express their talents, their gifts, their expertise, to create a community of caring for these children. Because if nothing else, this book says to the children, we hear you. You know, we have taken the words that you've shared with us and we have put them out in you know, the world's history. And it's a way to like affirm their experience and to, you know, to acknowledge the harm that's been done to them. And I think that that helps, that can help give them hope. And it also can help give, I think, the world hope that when we're all feeling despair over some of the things that are happening in the world, that we can't take away the cause of that despair, but that we can give hope by saying, we hear you, we share your concerns, and we're committed to work with you to find ways to move forward to address these things. What do you think?
Well, I think there's something also very human about hope, that we all have hope. Hopefully we'll have hope. The children that we've talked to all have hopes. We would end our interviews talking to them about what they were planning, what they would hope would be their life in a year or so, or they would just tell us these things. And I was thinking about, when I was reading this question, about a different context where I've been doing a lot of work in France, where I've been interviewing a lot of children and adults who are migrating. Their intent in many cases is to go on to the United Kingdom, and so they're camping out in forests, under bridges, and so on in northern France. And one of the people that I met during this during my time there is a photographer who is himself a refugee. He was recognized as a refugee a few years ago in France, and he takes a lot of images that are really about documenting misery and trying to show the world what the authorities in Europe are putting people who are seeking safety through. And so he's, to that extent, a photojournalist. But a lot of his images are hopeful, are that they show people enjoying themselves despite misery. They show sort of a triumph of human spirit over these really adverse conditions. And I don't know if that's art or something else, or if it's all of those things, including reflecting the reality that humans are complex enough that we can be enduring great hardship, and also retain our sense of our dreams, our goals, our vision, the things that motivate us to keep on going forward.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting because as you were talking about the children arriving to the United States, it reminded me of how hopeful almost all of them were. You know, that despite everything that they were going through and the brutality that they were experiencing, almost all of them had retained that hopefulness that brought them to the US to begin with. And I think about some of the research that's been done around children who arrive to the United States that shows that they are far more resilient than my children are, you know, who are native born, and my children are wonderful and they're tough and they're smart and resilient. But like these kids arriving to the United States, when you think about the conditions that they have gone through in order to get here, and then, you know, when they arrive, we basically have this incredible gift of having these really smart, surviving children who are resilient and hopeful and excited in many cases to come to the United States. I'd say most cases to come to the United States. And what we really should be doing is to recognize the gift that these kids are and to do everything that we can to foster, to cherish and foster that resilience and to help grow them into really strong leaders and community members. And yet the research shows that within 2 years of arrival, the resilience advantage that they had when they arrived to the United States had been worn down by the traumas they experienced at the border and then the racism that they experience once they start to integrate into the US. And so I think that, you know, part of it is to take these very hopeful, resilient children and create a child-centered border management policy and system that recognizes who they are and the gift that they are to our country and our communities, and to, protect those attributes rather than wear them down, the kids down, with the mistreatment that we witnessed and documented.
Warren, there's a question about the pandemic, how it's affected children and what's being done to try to mitigate the spread of COVID-19 while also keeping families together. I have a couple of thoughts about that, but if you want to go ahead, start us off.
Yeah, why don't you go ahead, Michael?
Well, I'm just thinking of a couple of things. One is that, the answer depends a bit about which group of children we're talking about. So for children who are arriving today at the border, there is, unfortunately, for many, still a Trump era rule in place in the name of public health, of sort of in the name of COVID prevention, that allows Border Patrol agents to turn people back, to summarily expel them. No due process, no hearing, no pretense at sort of like trying to figure out if they have a claim for asylum that should be taken seriously. That's true for adults arriving. That's true for adults arriving with children. So families that arrive. That doesn't apply to unaccompanied children at the very least, but everybody else can be summarily expelled under this. It's not even a law. It's in my mind, questionable application of a 100-year-old law that has a very vague regulation and is based on an order by the Centers for Disease Control, right? So its legal basis, I think, as a lawyer, I'm a little bit skeptical about. Nonetheless, more than 1 million people have been turned back, have been expelled. And so that's not so much about keeping families. It doesn't have the purpose of keeping families together. It doesn't have the purpose, even I don't think really, of keeping families safe or the United States safe, because at the same time, we're of course seeing the borders open as of last week for tourists traveling from Canada or Mexico by land with a vaccination card. I mean, there are clearly other ways, as the US government has recognized in the case of casual tourism, there are other ways of safeguarding the population at large against the pandemic. And the equities, to my mind, suggest that when you've got people who are fleeing persecution, fleeing serious harm, that you should find some way that bends over backwards to accommodate their safety and resolve whatever issues that you need to resolve with respect to, disease, virus, the prevention of the spread of COVID-19. So that's a bit of a partial answer to that question in any event.
Yeah, you and I will be going back to the border here in a couple of months. It'll be our first time together since the pandemic led to the shutdown in the US. What do you think we're going to see?
I don't know. I don't know because, we've talked a lot about US government actions, and we haven't really talked about what Mexico is doing or not doing. And unfortunately, a lot of what Mexico is doing, the government is doing, is not great in terms of its own refugee protection practices. So we're hearing a lot of accounts of people being pushed from Mexico into Guatemala, for example, being rounded up in the northern cities of Mexico, so the ones that border the US. And at the same time, some of the state governments on the border, for example, Chihuahua, as one state government, seem to have done quite a lot to try to figure out both the best ways they can of recognizing that they've got large numbers of people who intend to travel onto the US when it becomes possible, who need shelter, who need healthcare, who need access to the basic necessities of life. And I just don't know enough about what they're doing with respect to the pandemic. The last time I was there was, I guess, in late March 2020, so just before the borders effectively closed. And at that point, at least, Ciudad Juarez felt safer in terms of COVID prevention than El Paso did. I wonder if that'll be the same. I really honestly don't know.
Yeah. Do you want to talk a little bit about the research that we want to do next related to education and children in migration?
Yeah. I'll just say one or two things, and then I know you've got thoughts as well. I think because Mexico is obviously historically a transit country and increasingly a destination country for a lot of people, both people who are fleeing harm and so are entitled to asylum, and others who may be fleeing for or traveling for reasons that aren't necessarily recognized in law as a basis for switching countries, but we all know that in real life are very, very real reasons for doing so. And so the reality is that there are lots of people in Mexico who are migrants, whose country of origin is somewhere other than Mexico. And I think one of the questions is, as for, in particular, those who were pushed back into Mexico from the US, either under a program called Remain in Mexico, a program where people were allowed to seek asylum in the US, but told they had to wait in Mexico while they did so. And so some 60,000 people were in this situation, or those who were summarily expelled, or maybe new arrivals who haven't even tried to cross yet. What is the situation for them, and in particular for children, in terms of access to education? They've got a right to it. Now that in many cases people have been in Mexico far longer than planned, I would hope that they're able to send children to school, and that children have been receiving an education for the last couple of years. But we know, at least anecdotally, that doesn't happen a lot. Either there are barriers from the school, or that the physical location of the school is too far away, or the parents are fearful. There are lots of reasons why that may not be happening. And I think one of the questions that we have is, what is Mexico doing about education for these children, for children that are staying, I think in many cases, far longer than they had planned to, than their families had planned to, and may end up being there for a good portion of their childhood.
Yeah. Well, I am so grateful to you, Michael, for the opportunity to work with you on all of this. And I love the fact that you never stop, that we've gone from the US border to you work in, northern France. And of course, there was lots of work before that. And now we're heading down to the border again in 2022 to continue our work from a new angle. And so I really appreciate the opportunity to collaborate with you on all of this. And I appreciate having this platform today with Andy Bookstores to share this children's book and to tell a little bit about the context in which that was created. Christina, I'm going to hand it off to you. And I think you're muted.
All right, thank you. Thank you, Warren and Project Amplify, for your leadership in this book. And thank you, Michael, and your work to make sure that this book can be read in languages that the children understand. I appreciate your time today, letting us be a part of this intimate and illuminating conversation. Thanks also, of course, to Indies Unite and the work they do to explore the issues in this work and to leave, as they say, no curiosity unexplored. Also, of course, thanks to Bookshop for your work in organizing this important event. And finally, thanks to all of the people who joined us today. You know, you're here and you're supporting Hear My Voice, and you're also, as you learned, supporting children you may never meet. And that's very, very important. Remember, of course, a link for resources to use with this book, Hear My Voice, in, again, both English and in Spanish. I can't get over how excited I am about that. Will be, you know, linked to you after the event, and it was also linked to you in the beginning in the Q&A section. So good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for being here.
Thank you, Christina. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.